Okay, do you see my screen okay?
We do, yes.
Awesome.
You're good.
I'm here to talk about some of the lessons learned from the Winlink HF Vera peer-to-peer exercise that was conducted as part of the 29 July ARRL Activity Day. Okay, I've just changed slides. I want to make sure the screen is changed with me because sometimes that doesn't work. Did we go to the next slide?
You're also good.
Excellent. Thank you. So some things we'll talk about during this presentation is what is that center frequency versus dial frequency in the Winlink Express application window. We'll get into some history on that and the idea of training that, because there's a bit of a difficulty when some people are using dial frequencies and other people are using center frequencies, and unless you get on the same sheet of music, you don't establish communications link. After that, we'll talk about Vera bandwidth selection, and then the Winlink message versus peer-to-peer message, and then leave it open to anybody else who wants to contribute what they learned from the event. So these are from my perspective, and I'm sure others have more, so please feel free at the end to add on. The first thing is center frequency versus dial frequency. Inside the Winlink Express session window for Vera, you'll see a center frequency window, which is pointed out here with the blue arrow. And in this case, it's 7072 or 7073.5. And it calculates the dial frequency, which is the window just to the right of that. And the dial frequency is what, of course, hams use to set their radios to. So very important to understand the difference between the two. You see there are 1.5 kilohertz different. That works for Winlink Vera waveforms. It may not work for other modes. So, but for this one, it's 1.5 kilohertz difference. And since we always use upper sideband for data communications, the center frequency will always be a kilohertz and a half higher than the dial frequency. Oops, moving on the other way. So there's two frequency control modes commonly used when you're using a Vera session. First is probably what a lot of people use is the rig being controlled by the software, the Winlink Express software application. And in that one, as I just mentioned, you enter the center frequency into the Winlink center frequency window, and it calculates the dial frequency and sends by serial port, actually USB port, over to the radio to set up on that dial frequency that is calculated from the center frequency. However, if you are not using software control of your radio, you dial in the frequency on the dial manually. So that's the rig is operating under manual frequency control, and you dial the frequency, in that case, to 7072 kilohertz. So like I say, there's one way you're doing it with the center frequency, and the other way you're doing it with the dial frequency, and confusion can become a problem. Let's review a bit about that center frequency versus dial frequency. Back in the old days, when there was no such thing as single sideband, you only had AM and later FM. The center frequency and the dial frequency are one and the same. The blue arrow shows at the top there, I don't know if my cursor can actually work over there, right there, the arrow. That's the center frequency and the dial frequency for an AM transmission. Here's a quiz question. This is from an AM broadcast station in the San Francisco Bay Area. What are these two strong sidebands up here? Anybody know? Okay, the answer to the question is that's the Ubiquity high definition radio subcarriers or sub sidebands that are conveying the digital data for the HD radio on AM. There's still some around. Okay, so that's AM. Symmetrically, the sidebands have an upper sideband over on this side, lower sideband on this side. And by the way, this display is that of a Kiwi SDR, listening to that AM radio station on 680 kilohertz up in the Bay Area. And you'll see that it reads out right here as 680. or the dial frequency, which is there, and the signal symmetrically either side of it. Moving on, so that's an example of where we came from, and here's where we are. Back in the mid to late 50s, we transitioned to single sideband, or began our transition over to single sideband. And single sideband is basically that AM signal that we just looked at, but we suppress one sideband and we get rid of the carrier in the middle between the two. So you just have, in this case, the upper sideband. This is a 20-meter ham signal showing here. And the blue arrow, once again, pointing to the dial frequency of 14,332 kilohertz. But you see, the signal is above that, but not below that. And so the center frequency would be roughly right in the middle here, roughly 1.5 kilohertz above the dial frequency, where I'm using my cursor to point it out. So back to that notion of a little history. Anybody recognize the radio in the upper right-hand corner? That's a Collins KWM1 transceiver, which is really one of the radios that came out during the peak of the sunspot cycle at the end of the 50s. It covered 20, 15, and 10 meters upper sideband and transmitted with 200 watts or 180 watts PEP input power. And that's a really popularized single sideband, that and a number of other radios. But this was the first compact ham radio single sideband transceiver, which was meant for mobile operations, and particularly since it only operated the three higher HF bands, 20, 15, and 10, to take advantage of long haul DX capabilities from your car, mobiling around, which was kind of neat. But it was really quickly popularized single sideband, which worked much better than AM. So as I just discussed, the dial frequency is different than the center frequency of the signal, as shown in that Kiwi SDR waterfall. And we've been trying to cope with that for years, both hams and military radio operators and professionals. What are you talking about when you're talking about what frequency you're on? You talk about center frequency or dial frequency. So center frequency is used primarily by folks who regulate the spectrum and spectrum managers, the folks who have to allocate spectrum efficiently to fit the most stations into the limited available spectrum. The thing is, the dial frequency on a single sideband signal, there is nothing at the dial frequency. It's all above it or below it. And so if you're trying to fit in a number of stations in really close together, you need to know what the actual center frequency of the energy is and roughly its bandwidth. And you get the bandwidth by the mode designation. For example, 2K8A3J would describe a 2.8 kilohertz bandwidth single sideband transmission. So the dial frequency, however, is what is used by all the radio operators, whether they be amateurs or military or whatever. That's the frequency you set into the radio, so that you can and you set it to upper sideband or lower sideband according to what's being used on the frequency you're on. Since the dial frequency and center frequency are nominally a kilohertz and a half apart, it's imperative the operator understands which is being used to avoid making a mistake, because that 1.5 kilohertz can break the link. You aren't going to understand the single sideband, and if you're sending a Vera transmission, as we did during activity day, you'll hear a very low pitched Vera signal, but it won't be in band to be able to decode. I thought I'd show this classic picture here. This is a Swan 350, which also was one of the radios that helped popularize single sideband. It came along a little bit later. It was much more affordable than the Collins KWM1, but it took a few shortcuts on how it implemented the design. And if you look closely at this display where the cursor is, you'll see there's two vertical lines for the frequency dial. The upper one is for lower sideband and the lower one is for upper sideband. This shows the suppressed carrier frequency, the dial frequency. And let's take a look at the one on the left here. Like I say, the energy is between that line and the next line. And so the center frequency is dead in the middle between the two. So the Swan 350 is a great little radio, had a nice smooth tuning dial, and had a whole bunch of tubes, and it really warmed up hot. So it was a piece of history which some people are still using these. And they were made here in San Diego County, which was kind of neat. And they were made until the invasion of radios coming from Japan, such as the Kenwood TS520 and the Yaesu FT101 and ICOM 720 and 735 and such. So the bottom line is know the difference between dial frequency and center frequency, and know what your operating instructions are, referring to whether they're referring to center frequency or dial frequency, and training and regular practice are key to success. So the next topic here was the session bandwidth on Vera. It was great to be reminded during this practice that this exists, because normally folks just use the default, which is 2.3 kilohertz, because that's the one that the Winlink gateways use. So we use that on Vera peer-to-peer as well. Well, there are others. I found a number of references on the web to using 500 hertz. And that is a great thing for crowded bands. For example, if you're on 20 meters on the weekend, 500 hertz Vera peer-to-peer bandwidth would be probably the best thing to use, because there's all kinds of activity. But the problem is it's completely incompatible with the 2.3 and the even wider mode, the 2.75 kilohertz bandwidth. So it's very important to know which bandwidth you have selected, and I'll show you how to find that out here in a bit. And 2.3 kilohertz, like I say, is used by the Winlink gateway nodes, and I see I misspelled shares there. Let's fix that. There's many of the non-amateur services, such as Shares, Mars, and U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary, all use the 2.3 kilohertz. It's wider, yep, but it's also roughly 4 times faster than the 500 hertz mode. And more as time has gone along, we want to send forms, pictures, and other files, and speed becomes an issue. So if the band is not crowded, like when we run our digital net on Sunday mornings, 40 meters is pretty vacant. So we use the 2.3 kilohertz bandwidth. 2.75 kilohertz bandwidth has the highest throughput. However, 2.75 kilohertz actually exceeds the bandwidth of many single sideband radios. So you have to kind of choose your radio, choose your bandwidth to fit your radio. For example, that KWM1 that I showed early on, the first popular single sideband transceiver, had a bandwidth set by the mechanical filter of 3.1 kilohertz. So that would handle this okay. However, immediately succeeding that was the KWM2 and the S line, and they used the 2.1 kilohertz bandwidth, which was probably too narrow to handle that 2.3 kilohertz Vera waveform. And there are other radios that offer a 1.8 kilohertz bandwidth for a narrow single sideband, and they would have a real problem with the 2.3 and the 2.75 kilohertz. So we're going to take a quick look at what are the differences here between those. And this is right off of some Wikipedia page. It talks about the difference in the waveforms between the 3 different modes, with the right side being the 500 hertz mode, the middle being the 2.3 kilohertz mode, and the 2.75 kilohertz mode on the left. And you see the wider bandwidth gives you more options, and ultimately, with the best signal conditions, a higher throughput. And so, as I say, the 2.3 kilohertz bandwidth versus the 500 hertz bandwidth is roughly a 4-to-1 difference. Could be that much. How do I get to that selection? Well, in the Vera session screen, when you go to Winlink Express and launch a Vera peer-to-peer session, you bring it up, you go into the settings up here, and you go to Vera TNC setup, and this little window up here comes up, and you have the choice of 500, 2300, or 2750. And so that's where you make your selection there. And there's a basically an execute button down there. It's covered up by stuff on my screen, but I can't see. I can't read it off for you, but nonetheless, it's there. So that's how you set the mode. And like I say, if you're going to select anything other than 2300, when you go back to do regular Winlink operations going into a gateway, be sure that to check your bandwidth, make sure it hasn't been changed. I think that the program actually, when you set it up for peer-to-peers, it just makes a peer-to-peer bandwidth selection, and the gateway selection may be different from that. There was one thing we learned also from this is that there is in the Vera TNC setup screen, there is this option down here by the blue arrow to accept 500 hertz connections. So I was attempting to connect with some of the folks in North County. They were using 500 hertz and I was using 2.3 kilohertz. I found this, we set it up, and yes, I could get a connection from them, but when I tried to reconnect with them and send my acknowledgement of the message or a response to the message, I couldn't do that unless I went back to that other screen we just covered and changed my system to 500 hertz. So if you ever get a unidirectional connection with a station, that may be the reason why. So I leave this 500 hertz one checked now, so that if we do have that, at least we get one-way compatibility. But ultimately, the way to ensure full compatibility is to make the same bandwidth selection at that Vera session screen. And I think I've said a lot of this already. Yeah, so if you get a one-way connection, you may be set up using that to enable 500 hertz connections. Another thing that came out during the activity day was traditionally we send Winlink messages. Well, they call them Winlink messages as opposed to peer-to-peer messages, and Winlink messages go through gateways. And so when you start writing your message, you go to this screen, and your message screen, and it says settings or send as. It says Winlink message, Winlink message, radio only message, or peer-to-peer message. Radio only is something I'm not going to cover here, but those are the two selections: the Winlink message and the peer-to-peer message, which we will use for what we're doing. And if you have written a message in Winlink message, it works fine on the telnet connection. It works fine on going through a gateway, but it doesn't work for peer-to-peer. You have to make it into a peer-to-peer message to be able to send it peer-to-peer, and vice versa. If you get a message on peer-to-peer and you want to forward it back out over the gateway, you've got to turn it into a Winlink message. Otherwise, it doesn't work through the system. So those are the things I learned. Does anybody like to pass on any Winlink VARA HF peer-to-peer lessons learned from the activity day?
KC6MIE.
Hi, Steve. Go ahead.
Well, you know, a couple of the videos that I've looked at in the past advocate using the 500 for crowded band conditions and so forth. But excuse me, I wish there was just, as you're saying, use the 2300 as the default. And I like that. You know, you got to make sure that they're both sites are using the same bandwidth. So that's one thing. I wish they would, if it is a standard, I wish they would, the YouTube videos were advocating like 500. And, but it really, I don't know. But anyway, one thing I did learn from my end, I practice over a week at home, my home station, same radio, same laptop, sending peer-to-peer, and I had it down flawlessly. And then I get to my field setup, something changed because in my audio settings, and I spent almost the entire time allotted this past activity day to do peer-to-peer. Finally, at the very end, I got it working. I couldn't transmit. It was in an audio setting on my laptop. So anyway, that's what I've learned. So, but you know, we should establish, I think, the bandwidth and on, so we're, you know, because that's the big thing. You know, if one of them isn't on one bandwidth and the other one is, and you're not, it's only going to be one-sided, as you say. That's all I have. A learning experience, though.
Indeed, Steve. Well, thanks for that. Any other lessons learned from the activity day, Vera effort?
RKM.
Go ahead, Roy.
Yeah, I was very confused about upper sideband and lower sideband, but you answered that question very early on in your presentation. But my radio in IC 706. I was following along on activity day from home, and I couldn't figure out how to switch from lower sideband to upper sideband because it defaulted to lower. I had to drag out the manual of this 30-year-old radio to figure that out. So one thing you might want to do before you dig into this is figure out how to switch upper and lower sideband.
I totally agree. Yes, we can get into why that is, but the convention on ham radio is to use lower sideband below 10 megahertz and below, and above 10 megahertz using upper sideband for voice. For digital, such as Vera peer-to-peer or the FL Digi modes, we always use upper sideband no matter what band it is. So on the IC 706, I think you just hit the sideband button and give it a long press, and it switches over to the other sideband, is my recollection.
Yeah, that's correct. It's a mode button, and I didn't remember that, so I had to get the manual
out. There you go. In regards to the standard for the bandwidth, when Winlink first came out, there was a great kerfuffle about the bandwidth that the Winlink waveforms was taking, particularly the PAC-TOR at the time. And of course, Vera came along much later. And so I think there are a lot of folks who are concerned about how much bandwidth is being taken. And so that's why there's folks promoting the 500 hertz bandwidth to better fit in with the available users. Having said that, the activity on the bands with FT8, everybody's concentrated on the FT8 bands, and there's a lot of spectrum available now outside of that that's available. So I don't see nearly as much reason as there used to be for limiting your Vera bandwidth. But if it is crowded, definitely that's the way to go. And also it may work better under poorer signal conditions. So that's another thing to look at as an option. But that's some thoughts there. But Steve brought up something about understanding how it all works, and practice and training are all part of that. And one of the ways for practicing that is every Sunday we have a digital net. We do FL Digi primarily, but we also do Vera peer-to-peer, and you're welcome to join us there on 7072 kilohertz, about 90915. And we have voice coordination on the 224.9 repeater and the ARRL DMR talk group 310343. And you can join the roughly half dozen or so of us that get together and exchange the ICS 213 messages by either of those two modes, and keep our systems and our training up to speed so we're ready to be able to send messages. And that's all I had, unless there's any questions. If you want to send me an email, k1ct@arrl.net, be happy to engage on any questions afterwards.
Perfect. Thank you, Bill. Any questions?
Hey, Bill, excellent presentation. I think it's a great idea that we should in San Diego codify best practices for bandwidth on VAR peer-to-peer. And with the upcoming September Activity Day also being a regional event, we could maybe have discussions. I'll take the lead on that with Los Angeles to see what they're going to do, and then we can make sure we're all on the same page. K6RJF.
Thanks, Rob, and sounds a great idea. Coordination's a good thing. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else have anything before we close today's meeting? Looking at chat, not seeing anything. All right, very good. Watch for emails leading up to the September live event. We'll call it September Live. Patrick. You are off mute, Patrick, but I'm not hearing you. Patrick, it looks like you're toggling on and off. Right now you are off mute, but we're not hearing you.
All right, how about now?
Now you're good.
Okay, there's something wrong with the settings here. When we're talking about the activity day coming up in September, is there a possibility that you can contact and make arrangements with the director at the Kearney Mesa Rec Center about using one of their main rooms to conduct the get on air workshop / or conducting the ham, I guess is going to be testing as well. That way there's less noise and interference that might make it a lot more pleasant for the attendees.
We can look at that.
All right, thank you very much.
All right.
Comments
Last call.
also. Regarding the activity day, last time we had this, I set up my antenna out away from other people's antennas. And it was no problem with the early ultimate Frisbee game. We were out there a little longer than most, and I don't know, maybe 11:30, something like that. Another group comes in who has the field reserved, and they demand all of the field. It's ridiculous, but they feel that they must have, 1,000 meters by 1,000 meters square, etc. I'm being facetious here, but it is notable that they think they own every square inch of grass, and it could be an issue in the future. It would be beneficial to have your things set up closer to the sidewalk, as I learned, and their designation of the space could change based on the condition of the field. They might want to come closer to where we're parking. Perhaps we could get a permit. I don't know how feasible that is for a certain number of hours. That is all.
Thanks, Ted. We'll look at that, and we'll find out who else has the field reserved on the day of our event. Thanks.
Yeah, I have some input. You might want to talk to their center director over there regarding that situation.
All right, if nothing else, we'll wrap it up. Thank you everybody for attending today. We look forward to seeing you all in person next month. Have a good Saturday and have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bruce. Bye, everybody.